Wizards fans are a little too familiar with losing, far more than they should be, and it shouldn't really come as a surprise. The Wizards franchise has been doing the same thing, following the same formula for nearly its entire existence to no avail. But when you have a franchise that has scraped by as long as the Wizards, it also shouldn't come as a surprise that at least some of its history features some periods of success. It wasn't long ago when the Wizards were competing, and literally a game away from the conference finals, led by a prime John Wall and a blossoming playmaker in Bradley Beal, all while being backed by a generous mix of promising youth and skilled veterans. That playoff run was just in 2017, and in 2021, as the uneasy fan base and ugly record would suggest, times have changed. Instrumental to that change was a slew of ill-advised trades, untimely injuries, and less than perfect draft selections. But after the firing of Ernie Grunfeld and finishing in the bottom third of the Eastern Conference 2 years in a row, the trade for Russell Westbrook was a move that was intended to reinvigorate the franchise. And it made sense. And even at the time of this recording, it makes sense. The Wizards got more out of Westbrook than the Rockets got out of John Wall. But did the Wizards really win? It took some time, but they got their combo guard pairing and earned a real opportunity to sneak into the playoffs with them. But the problem is, it isn't sustainable. The Eastern Conference has grown increasingly competitive and talented, while Westbrook has grown older and more expensive. And it's clear this roster brings nothing to truly make a significant playoff run, even when fully healthy. In other words, the addition of Westbrook does little to significantly change the Wizards' fortunes. It's simply a temporary veneer of winning basketball. And like many other transactions like it in Wizards history, it's probably left many fans with nothing but a looming concern of it all crumbling down again. Longtime Wizards fans have been here before. Win-now expenditures have never, and probably will never, pan out, and the Westbrook trade might be the latest iteration. So let's explore the Wizards' shameful history of botching the win-now formula, and how it's been an ever-present, perpetually harmful fixture throughout Wizards history. Let's start in 1995. The then-named Washington Bullets were coming off their 8th consecutive losing season, and hadn't sniffed a playoff appearance since 1987 when their team featured a veteran duo of Bernard King and Moses Malone. As they lost for nearly a decade and endlessly searched for a winning recipe, they landed some of the best front-court talent the future of the NBA had to offer. Juwan Howard, Chris Webber, and Rasheed Wallace had all, one way or another, made their way onto the 1995 roster. And for Washington, the next step was to pair them with a veteran guard to complement the youthful lineup and facilitate a push for the playoffs. So the Cleveland Cavaliers called in the offseason of 1995. They happened to have a point guard they were looking to offload, and the Bullets were desperate. In exchange for a first-round pick in the 1996 draft, the Cavs offered a 31-year-old Mark Price, a former cornerstone of their franchise, who turned into a lesser version of himself entering his 30s. In spite of the considerable concern and disagreement within the organization, General Manager John Nash relented and took the deal. Like I said, Washington was desperate to make it back to the playoffs, and had already flopped on a few guard acquisitions in the months preceding the trade. So they got Mark Price, one of the original members of the 50-40-90 club, a more than capable scorer, playmaker, and all-star, and got a reasonable roster to surround him with, allowing Washington to make the playoffs, sell tickets, and get back to their
No.
Not only was Price completely disinterested in playing for the organization at the time of the transaction, he was coming off one of his worst seasons with the Cavaliers. In 1994, he missed over 30 games due to injury. Those same troubles persisted throughout the offseason and carried on entering his 1995 season, ultimately evolving to an unfortunate case of plantar fasciitis, a condition that Washington was very well aware of at the time of the trade, but gambled on anyways, hoping that the injury would go away. So there they were, the Wizards organization teetering off the edge of a cliff and looking at yet another losing season as a result of an overly eager attempt to find a point guard and make it into the playoffs. Price had, by far, the least productive season of his career with Washington, only starting in 1 game and playing in 7 total. Still, Washington managed to mark up an improved record from the year before, but remained at the bottom of the conference. What's more, going into the summer of 1996, the rest of the NBA's bottom feeders were gearing up for what ended up being one of the greatest drafts in NBA history, while Washington, having already given away their first-round pick for the corpse of Mark Price, watched as history unfolded. With their performances in the 1995 season, Washington would have held the 12th pick overall. On the board at that time of the draft was Steve Nash, Peja Stojakovic, Jermaine O'Neal, and some scrawny high schooler out of Lower Merion by the name of Kobe Bryant. That was one of the first times Washington compromised a chance to develop talent in hopes of a quick playoff thrill, but it certainly wasn't the last. Washington fans would only have to wait another year for that. In 1996, the Bullets still had no backcourt, but had really raw talent that could serve as prime trade capital. So they swapped new for old again, and traded Rasheed Wallace for a 30-year-old Rod Strickland and one season with 31-year-old Harvey Grant. Harvey Grant was largely a non-factor, averaging 4 points per game, playing 20 minutes per contest in his lone season, but Strickland was good throughout his 4 years with the organization, as advertised, and is widely considered to be a fan favorite among many. But he was also already headed into the back end of his career at the time of the trade, and in his early 30s only managed to show off his spectacular layup package on a still struggling franchise that only made the playoffs once during his tenure. Meanwhile, as Washington spent the early 2000s as an afterthought, Rasheed Wallace went on to develop into an all-star, franchise cornerstone, and NBA champ. And it wasn't like Washington had no idea he'd be this good. They selected him with the 4th pick in the NBA draft, and watched him turn into an immediate all-rookie talent in his first year. So in the eyes of many, his departure just wasn't worth the short-lived late prime stint of Strickland. 2 years passed after the Rasheed Wallace trade, and the newly named Wizards, a name change owner Abe Pollin conducted for obvious reasons, pounced on the opportunity to make another dumbass trade to really typify the tradition of the franchise. So they set their sights on sending Chris Webber elsewhere, and found a suitable buyer in Sacramento in 1998. According to Wes Unseld, the GM at the time, the trade was about seeking a mature leader for the franchise, and in all fairness, Webber was not that. At the time of the trade, Webber wasn't the best role model, having already gotten involved with the law on 2 occasions, regularly missing out on team activities, and even going out as far as to admit himself that he wasn't the best team leader. So, despite leading the Wizards with 21.5 points and 9.5 rebounds a game, the former Rookie of the Year was sent off to the Kings, where he of course blossomed into a hallmark of that franchise and was a regular contender in the West in the early 2000s. Mitch Richmond and Otis Thorpe, the 2 30-year-olds that Washington acquired in the transaction, played a combined 4 seasons with the Wizards and didn't contribute much to their sub-30 win campaigns. And just like that, Webber's trade quickly became another misguided attempt to reconfigure the franchise as fast as possible. It wasn't the worst decision at the time. However, if the Wizards were patient on the young star, who reportedly was interested in staying and turning a new leaf, they likely would have had the franchise mainstay they were looking for. And to close out the century in 1999, the Wizards also made a trade to move a 25-year-old Ben Wallace for a year of a 30-year-old Ike Austin. Wallace eventually made his way to Detroit to become a 4-time Defensive Player of the Year and NBA champion. And Washington was of course left with an aged roster that didn't produce anything of note. But at the turn of the century, the franchise would end up joining forces with an aged talent unlike the NBA world had ever seen. So there's a lot in the Jordan era, but I'll try to keep it brief. After retiring with the Bulls in 1999, Michael Jordan became the Wizards' vice president of basketball operations, as well as a minority owner in January of 2000. And in September 2001, Jordan came out of retirement at age 38 to play for Washington. In his first year, he averaged 23, 5, and 5 on 34 minutes per game. But with few notable athletes to add to his efforts and a bum knee late in the season, the Wizards only managed a 37 and 45 record. And in 2002, Jordan responded to his first ever season under 500 by taking off his hooping hat and putting on his executive hat in search for some help. So he signed a 32-year-old Byron Russell, sent a 24-year-old Richard Hamilton and 2 other players to Detroit for 2 seasons of a 28-year-old Jerry Stackhouse and signed a 39-year-old Charles Oakley. With the improved roster, Jordan opted for a 6-man role on the bench to keep his knee fresh throughout the 82-game season. He ended up starting anyway due to injuries and poor play on the starting lineup, but played in all 82 games and averaged 20, 6, and 4 on 37 minutes per game. And even after all that, the Wizards finished with the same exact record as the year before, 37 and 45. The veterans he acquired, of course, added nothing to the franchise and only furthered Washington's futility, while Rip Hamilton joined 2 other former Wizards in Ben Wallace and Rasheed Wallace to complete the championship nucleus at Detroit. After the 02-03 season, Jordan retired as a player and was soon after fired by owner Abe Pollan as team president because Pollan believed Jordan's role had harmed the franchise, so he replaced him with Ernie Grunfeld. And after some tidying up for the roster, the Wizards actually made it back as fringe playoff contenders behind the talents of Gilbert Arenas, Antoine Jameson, and later Caron Butler, but were regular first-round outs for 3 years straight. But Grunfeld's work would ultimately reflect the status quo of the organization soon enough. His tenure was no different than his predecessors. Following an injury-hampered season from Arenas, the Wizards ended up missing the playoffs and won only 19 games in the 08-09 season and were rewarded with the 5th pick in the 2009 draft. But before they could reach the draft, they traded the pick to the Timberwolves for a 29-year-old Mike Miller and Randy Foye, who both played for just a season. Once again missing out on a prime opportunity to rebuild and develop instead of pursue an endless carousel of mediocrity for the short thrill of getting bounced out in the first round of the playoffs. And with the 5th pick, the Wolves selected Ricky Rubio. However, if Washington had kept their spot on the board, they would have had a chance to draft DeMar DeRozan, Drew Holiday, Brendan Jennings, or some scrawny kid from Davidson by the name of Stephen Curry. They instead walked away from the 2009 draft with nothing. In 2016, the Wizards traded yet another first-round pick along with DeJuan Blair and Chris Humphries for a serviceable but overpriced stint with Markieff Morris. Though the pick was top 9 protected and ended up being the 13th overall, the Wizards could have had a chance at Karis LeVert, Pascal Siakam, DeJounte Murray, or Malcolm Brogdon. They, of course, once again, left empty-handed. And that brings us to the present in 2020. Where Washington trades a 30-year-old John Wall and a first-round pick for a 32-year-old Russell Westbrook. And as it unfolds in the present, you'll find it shares similarities to the wild trades that came before it. A potential valuable first-round selection tossed along with a beloved athlete for a couple of prime years of an older veteran in pursuit of a playoff resurgence. But I'll admit, Westbrook is special. Not only is he a generational talent, he's undeniably entertaining to watch and especially beneficial in some ways for the young roster. Barring the injury and COVID-19 laden start of the season, the Wizards have had a great 2021 campaign, but I also can't deny how harmful this trade could be for the future. And whether this trade was an effort to appease Bradley Beal, or a decision that was what owner Ted Leonsis and GM Tommy Shepard felt would be in the best interest of the franchise, doesn't really matter. Like the ones that I've listed before it, it's prevented the organization from making any real long-term improvements. It's kept Scott Brooks from facing any real backlash. Being Westbrook's former coach and in somewhat good graces with management bodes well for the 6-year coach, but it's allowed him to make far too many mistakes. With his mismanagement of the rotation, Brooks, for whatever reason, felt it was necessary to surround his new guard duo with shooters that the team didn't have. He used Deni Avdija, a young talent drafted for his playmaking ability as a spot-up three-point shooter, and did the same with Ish Smith, a highly touted ball handler. And he oftentimes played them together in lineups with Westbrook, another ball-dominant guard, not only making for horrendous spacing, but pretty ugly basketball at times. Brooks did the same with Daniel Gafford, a trade acquisition on the deadline, oftentimes keeping the young center off the court in crunch time despite him being the most talented big on the roster. It took a 17-32 start for Brooks to finally figure out a lineup and finish 17-6 for a play-in appearance and a first round out in the playoffs. A run that was admittedly fun to watch, but pretty inconsequential when it came to what it meant for their postseason hopes. No guarantees of a true playoff spot, no chances of really making a real title push, just vibes, triple-doubles, and masterful Bradley Beal performances. And thanks to the late season playoff push, they lost out on a chance on earning a potential lottery pick in a top-heavy draft class.
It's not easy for me to admit that I've been standing in the same place for 18 years.
Well, I've been standing with you. I've been right here with you, Troy. I got a life, too. I gave 18 years of my life to stand in the same spot as you. Don't you think I ever wanted other things? Don't you think I had dreams and hopes? What about my life? What about me?
Triple-doubles, playoff appearances, and late regular season wins isn't the winning basketball Washington thinks it is. It's mediocrity. Under Abe Pollin and now Ted Leonsis, this has been the bottom line. And it'll never be enough if the Wizards ever hope to return to the game's biggest stage. So how many rides on this endless carousel will it take for Washington to recognize the error in its ways? For the sake of the fans, hardcore and otherwise, hopefully Westbrook is the last spin.